Awakening of ethnic consciousness. In the process of the consolidation of the Turkish community on the Bulgarian lands, its ethnic consciousness began to form. The Turkish population gradually realized its place among the nationalities inhabiting the Ottoman Empire. The sense of race, language, and ethnic culture acquired a distinct character. It developed a sense of belonging to the Turkish nation, as it participated in the process of its consolidation. The Turkish nation was formed in the period from the end of the 14th to the middle of the 16th century in Anatolia, and in certain areas of the Balkan Peninsula. After the inclusion of Rumelia within the boundaries of the Ottoman Empire and the transformation of Constantinople into its capital, certain political, economic and cultural relations arose between the two regions. The unified state created the necessary prerequisites for the rapprochement of the various Turkish and Turkic tribal communities, and certain elements of the local population. According to the Turkish researcher Halil İnalcık, about 70% of the Turkish population represented communities of Turkic descent, and 30% the local Asia Minor and Rumelian population. Due to the insufficient intensity of socio-economic and cultural ties between the individual regions of the empire, the ethnic groups preserved some of their peculiarities in everyday life and culture for quite a long time. In general, however, they spoke the same language, belonged to a culture based mainly on Islamic Turkish values and traditions. During this period, the ancient ethnonym Turk or Tuğuk began to gain popularity. It is found in a number of diplomatic documents since the 13th century. However, in a certain period it was overshadowed by the name of the Ottoman dynasty, which established its dominance over all Turkish beyliks. Its revival was due to the fact that all Turkic tribal communities that came to Anatolia and the Balkans bore this name. Moreover, in the process of their mixing with each other and with a certain part of the local population, the Turkish language prevailed. Therefore, the people of the newly formed nationality were considered Turks. However, this ethnonym became popular mainly among the broad masses of the people and especially among the peasantry. In the consciousness of the ruling class, the religious and the Ottoman self-consciousness dominated. Those belonging to this class defined themselves as Muslims and Ottomans. The existence of such self-awareness is natural, since the ruling Ottoman class was recruited from elements originating from various nationalities. Through the concept of Muslims, it sought to neutralize the spiritual ideological ethnic diversity of the Ottoman society. Therefore, for several centuries, the Turkish ethnic consciousness was pushed into the background by the Islamic Ummah consciousness. From this nationality, at a later stage, the Turkish nation began to form over a fairly extensive Anatolian and Rumelia region. Tanzimat reforms in the socio-economic, military and cultural fields helped to some extent. The reforms, along with some other factors, gave some impetus to trade and industrial production. The Ottoman economy began to be included in the world economy. Emerging new social relations also gave birth to new ideas. They were popularized by that intelligentsia that was educated in secular schools in the country and abroad. The military medical, and military engineering schools established in the 30s and 50s of the 19th century had a more secular character. After the Tanzimat, the number of servants and the intelligentsia grew rapidly. The latter had certain opportunities to get acquainted with the scientific, technical, and socio-economic achievements of Western countries. Some intellectual circles were influenced by the nationalism that dominated Western public thought. The idea of a national state and social progress gained relevance also due to the fact that among the Balkan peoples located within the boundaries of the Ottoman Empire, the movement for national sovereignty and national statehood began to strengthen. Gradually, the idea of a national state and independent development gained popularity among non-Turkish Muslim nations. The emergence of Arab nationalism was a particular challenge for the Turkish intelligentsia and certain political circles. Under the influence of the mentioned social and ideological factors, towards the middle of the 19th century, the Turkish national idea began to emerge, to form the Turkish national consciousness. The first manifestations of the national idea or positive Turkish nationalism were noticed in the mid-60s of the 19th century. In its initial form, this idea crept into the ideology of the Ottoman liberals, united in the New Ottomans movement. The leaders of this movement, Midhat Pasha, the poets Namık Kemal, Ziya Pasha, and Ibrahim Shinasi, sought to impose certain social and political reforms that would lead to the liquidation of the absolutist sultan system. Key elements in their ideological and political platform were the idea of a constitutional monarchy, Ottoman fatherland, and Ottoman nation. The idea of a nation-state and a Turkish nation at that time had not yet clearly crystallized. It merged with the concept of a single Ottoman fatherland and Ottoman nation. However, the Turks were already seen as a factor that would unite the Ottoman nation. This fact itself objectively fueled Turkish nationalism and gave birth to a desire for national separation. In the 60s, 70s of the 19th century, Turkish nationalism found manifestations in the cultural and educational field. Prominent poets and writers such as Ibrahim Shinasi, 1840–1871, Ziya Pasha, 1825–1881, Namık Kemal, 1840–1888, and others, through their work, actually carried out a radical reform in the Turkish language, making it understandable to the people. The new literature, the foundations of which they laid, was permeated with freedom-loving and patriotic ideas and feelings. The process of establishing a language comprehensible to the people had significant patriotic dimensions. In this way, a whole Türkçecilik movement, adherents of the Turkish language, arose, the purpose of which was to clear the Turkish language of the Arabic and Persian lexicon and bring it closer to the spoken language. Leşay Osmani, Ottoman dialect, by Ahmed Vefik Pasha, 1823–1891, became a guide to this trend. Vefik Pasha was a representative of that part of the Tanzimat intelligentsia that sought to awaken national identity. All his scientific and literary activity was subordinated to this idea. He paid great attention to the improvement of the literary Turkish language, and its transformation into a language understandable to the people. Other scholars have tried to shed light on the historical and theoretical aspects of Turkish nationalism. Süleyman Pasha allocated a special place for the history of the Turks within the Great History. That part of the liberal Ottoman intelligentsia, which embraced the ideas of the Western European Enlightenment, much more consistently advocated Türkçülük, Turkism, i.e. the ideas of Turkish nationalism. Ali Suavi, 1839–1878, stood out among them. In his publications, especially on the pages of Mubir, he constantly discussed the issue of the need to develop the Turkish consciousness and language. The prominent publicist contrasted Turkism with Ottomanism and the Turkish consciousness with the Ottoman one. For the first time in the history of Ottoman public thought, Ali Suavi made an attempt to combine Turkism with Islamism and Europeanism. According to him, not only is there no contradiction between them, but they complement each other. In this way, prerequisites were created for the existence and development of the national consciousness in parallel with the religious and, in particular, the Ummah consciousness. A similar concept was supported a little later by one of the ideologues of Islamic modernism, Cemalettin Afghani. According to his belief, in order to bring about the unification of the Muslim nations, the national consciousness must first be awakened. The emergence of such ideas helped to overcome the opposition of the conservative wing of the Islamists, who claimed that nationalism was incompatible with Islam. Towards the end of the 19th century, especially after the Turkish-Greek War, 1897–1900, Turkism became active and became one of the main ideological and political currents in Turkish public thought. During this period, Bulgaria was still formally under the supreme authority of the Sultan, and the Rhodope region continued to be within the boundaries of the Ottoman Empire. Turkism, as a new trend in public thought, arose on the basis of Halkçılık, populism, and Turkçülük. In the last decades of the 19th century, the ideas of populism penetrated among the Turkish intelligentsia. journalists, writers, sociologists, etc., who united around the magazine Servitii Funan, and the Society for National Education, raised the slogan, "Toward the People." They set themselves the goal of enlightening the Turkish people and awakening their national self-consciousness. They organized a movement to simplify and Turkify the literary language in order to bring it closer to the people. This movement became significantly more active after the Young Turk Revolution, 1908. An important role in its strengthening was played by the newspaper Tanin, in which leading figures were poet and philosopher Riza Tevfik and Tevfik Fikret, magazines Turk Derneği, Turk Yurdu, and others. These publications advocated the need for economic and cultural progress. In this way, populism grew into a quest for national statehood and independent development. Turkism was the first more definite form of Turkish nationalism. In it, the aspiration to historical, economic, political and cultural separation of the Turkish nation is theoretically reflected. Its ideological and political platform included such democratic tasks as the elimination of medieval habits in everyday life and dependence on external colonial powers, replacement of absolute monarchy with a more democratic form of political government, etc. However, Turkism also contained some conservative elements. In the first decades of the 20th century, the reactionary utopian concept of uniting all Turkic peoples in one state and nation arose, which contradicted the idea of consolidating the Turkish nation and a national state. This perverted form of Turkism became popular under the name Panturanism or Pan-Turkism. As between these two forms, as well as between Turkism, Ottomanism, and Islamism, there was a sharp ideological struggle. Only with the appearance of Kemalism in the 1920s did positive nationalism become a dominant trend. At the same time, the borders of the Turkish nation were clearly defined, which coincided with the state borders of the Republic of Turkey. For the first time in history, a Turkish nation-state was created. The new processes, which developed in the ideological and cultural sphere of the Ottoman society during the last decades of the 19th century, and the beginning of the 20th century, largely reflected on the spiritual life of the Turkish population in Bulgaria, not only until the Russo-Turkish War, 1877–1878, but also after it. By virtue of the bilateral agreements, the Ottoman state was considered the spiritual protector of the Bulgarian Muslims. Cultural ties in one form or another continued until the mid-1930s. The relative geographical remoteness and insufficient development of the economic ties between Rumelia and Anatolia were unable to completely separate the Turkish population living on Bulgarian lands from the ideological and cultural processes that were developing in the Ottoman society. There were other significant factors that determined the emergence and confirmation of many common moments in the cultural life of the Turkish population of the two regions. Among them, the community of religion and language was of particular importance. Islamic religious views and values permeated from beginning to end the culture of the entire Turkish population, regardless of whether they lived in Asia Minor or the Balkans. Despite some differences between the dialects, the language was unified. This feature is also emphasized by K. Jayacek, who notes that the daily Orman Turkish language does not differ from Ottoman, although some pre-Ottoman words are also used. Indeed, in daily Orman Turkish language, certain words were pronounced in a special way, and even now some local expressions exist in it. But the grammatical construction, and basically the vocabulary, were the same. Therefore, T. Kowalski defines it as one of the many dialects of the Ottoman Turkish language. The Rumeli dialect had a strong influence on the emerging literary Turkish language. Therefore, an important means of communication was available. In the second half of the 19th century, the role of the educational system, the press and public libraries grew significantly. In Rumelia, during the Tanzimat era, the school network was expanded and the modernization of the educational system began. In 1875, there were 2,700 primary schools, 150 madrasas and 40 junior high schools in the Danube Vilayet. In the latter, secular academic disciplines were more widely advocated and therefore these schools had a more secular character. Their number significantly increased after the restoration of the Bulgarian state. The curricula and teaching methods in them were based on those principles that were applied in the Turkish education system not only until the liberation of Bulgaria, but also in the first decades after it. Teachers were mainly trained in Istanbul and other educational institutions of the Ottoman state. Among the teachers were many political emigrants who were forced to leave Turkey due to participation in the Young Turk movement. When the leader of the new Ottomans, Midhat Pasha, became the governor of the Rusey region, a number of socio-economic and cultural reforms were carried out in this region. It was then that the railway line Rusey-Kaspichan was built. Banks, as well as the first model agricultural holding, were established. In 1864, a regional printing house was opened in Rusey, where books, several newspapers, and magazines were printed. Among them, the Tuna newspaper, which popularized the political views of the new Ottomans in an understandable vernacular, stood out. In the 80s of the 19th century, about 12 newspapers in Turkish were published in Bulgaria. Then the influence of the Young Turk press began to grow. Of the 44 newspapers published in Turkish from 1878 to 1908, 25 propagated the ideological and political views of the Young Turks. Their organ İttifak, Concord, which began to appear in 1899, waged a struggle against the Sultan and his entourage. In the larger cities, public libraries were established with a significant amount of religious, literary and scientific literature in the Turkish language. Particularly important book centers were the libraries Murad II and Shahabedin Pasha in Plovdiv, Halil Sherif Pasha in Shumen, Seyfullah Efendi in Sofia, Vali Pazvantaglu Osman in Vidin. There were also large libraries in Rusey, Razgrad, Samarkand, Varna, Provadia, Nikopol, etc. In the second half of the 19th century, some of these cities became important cultural centers. Writers, poets and theologians lived and worked there, whose works became famous throughout Rumelia. The famous Ottoman theologian and astronomer Ali Kuşçu, for example, was a teacher in Plovdiv. The Sufi theologian Bali Effendi from the Sofia village of Kniazevo gained great popularity in the 16th century. His works, especially his commentary on the Arab Sufi philosopher Ibn Arabi's seminal work The Seals of Wisdom, had a significant influence on Islamic thought in the Ottoman Empire. In the new era, when the process of forming the Turkish national consciousness began on the Bulgarian lands, active literary and educational activities were developed by some of the more prominent representatives of the delayed Turkish Enlightenment, and the Young Turks. Ali Suavi, one of the consistent defenders of Turkism, for some time worked in Plovdiv as a teacher and president of the commercial court. He made efforts to popularize the Turkish national idea. Another supporter of Turkism, Ahmed Midhat, 1844–1912, studied at the Turkish Junior High School in Nis, lived in Vidin, and worked in Rusey as a civil servant and editor-in-chief of the first Turkish newspaper on the Balkan Peninsula, Tuna. The most characteristic feature of this newspaper is that it was written in an understandable vernacular. Articles promoting both Europeanism and Turkism often appeared in its pages. Ahmed Midhat's son-in-law, the poet Muallim Naji, also developed an active educational activity. He led the literary section of publications by Ahmed Midhat in Turjuman. Muallim Naji was the director of the Turkish Junior High School in Varna. The poet, who lived in the second half of the 19th century, was so progressive in his prose works that he was ahead of his time. Through the works of such cultural figures, through the educational system and the press, both the traditional Islamic views and the ideas of the new Ottomans, and the Young Turks were widely spread among the enlightened Turks in this region. With the help of artistic literature and the press, the ideas of Turkism, which was the first manifestation of Turkish nationalism, reached the Turkish population. Under its influence, among the Turkish population on the Bulgarian lands, especially among its intelligentsia, an ethnic self-awareness, without which the existence of any ethnic community is unthinkable, began to gradually form. It is inherent in every nationality and represents a subjective expression of an objective reality, which is the ethnic community with all its diverse features and appearances. The consciousness of the Turkish community, although it bears the imprint of Islam, also has national features. Indeed, religious consciousness in the Middle Ages, including up to the second half of the 19th century, largely overshadowed and relegated nationalism to the background. Religion was a major differentiator. Almost until the end of the 19th century, Islamists did not recognize national communities' right to exist in the Islamic world. But even during this period, the religious consciousness of people of different denominations was ethnically charged. Usually in our country, Islam used to be characterized as the Turkish faith, and Christianity as the Bulgarian faith. Gradually, the ethnic element also strengthened in the consciousness of the Turkish nation. In the first decades of the 20th century, the Turkish population began to define itself not only as Muslim, but also as Turkish. Others also defined it as Turkish. Its awareness of the common historical past, common language and culture, and common traditions and customs, to which it stubbornly adhered even after it was separated from the Turkish nationality, gradually became established in it. It was considered part of the Turkish ethnicity. In the new socio-political and ethno-cultural environment, formed after the Russian-Turkish War, 1877 to 1878, and the restoration of the Bulgarian state, the thinking, culture and lifestyle of the Turkish population began to gradually change. The Bulgarian cultural environment began to exert a certain influence on his culture, which until then was a part of the Ottoman culture. As a result, in the spiritual and material culture of the local Turkish population, certain features began to acquire a more distinct character. Specific elements were noticeable in its language. The Dayliorman dialect was formed in northeastern Bulgaria. The Rumelia dialect was initially quite close to the Istanbul dialect, i.e. to the literary Turkish language. The sociosphere and biosphere, which differed from those in Anatolia, left their mark on the overall, including the mental image of the emerging Turkish minority in Bulgaria. The most important feature of its mental appearance consisted in the organic combination of ethnic and civic self-consciousness. The Turkish population possessed a highly developed self-awareness of ethnic identity and constantly sought to preserve and develop it. Parallel to this, among the people belonging to the Turkish minority, a Bulgarian civic consciousness was gradually formed. Indeed, in the census of December 27, 1880, in the citizenship column, most wrote Ottoman subjects. But over time, the Turks began to accept Bulgaria as their homeland, to feel like its citizens and to treat its culture, values and traditions with respect. Thus, mainly two layers were formed in the ethnic consciousness of the Turkish population, ethnic and civil self-consciousness. In the process of historical development, an organic connection was established between Turkish ethnic and Bulgarian civic consciousness. However, a complete match has not been achieved, and is unlikely to be achieved. From time to time, under the influence of extreme situations, a contradiction appears between them. This feature of the mental profile of the Turkish population affected culture, civil behavior, and, in general, its overall historical development. The consolidation of the Turkish ethnic minority in Bulgaria is a complex and lengthy process. It began in the pre-Ottoman period with the settlement of a number of Turkic groups on Bulgarian lands. Some researchers assume that some of them preserved their Turkic identity and merged with the mass of Ottoman Turks who arrived here. It seems that some parts of the local population joined the latter. The process of accession of known ethnic groups to the Ottoman Turks was more characteristic of certain areas such as northeastern Bulgaria. Describing his impressions of Silistra, the famous Ottoman traveller Evliya Çelebi noted in his travelogues that the people in this area were a mixture of Anatolian soldiers, Tatars, Bulgarians and Vlachs. Some recent specialists who study the ethnogenesis of the Turkish population living in Bulgaria also note this feature. In the 1930s, the Polish Turkologist Professor Tadeusz Kowalski came to the conclusion that the Turkish-speaking population in northeastern Bulgaria arose from the successive fusion of three layers. The first was from the remnants of a northern Turkic layer. The second, a strong southern group that came here before the arrival of the Ottomans in Rumelia. The third layer was formed by Turkish colonists or Turkized elements from the Ottoman era. Kowalski's conclusions are primarily based on linguistic data, but they are also supported by some anthropological, ethnographic, and historical studies. Therefore, this thesis is basically shared by individual Bulgarian historians. Unlike the Polish scholar, however, they ignore the southern group that came before the Ottomans, and emphasize the role of Islamized and Turkized local elements. The participation of various components in the formation of the Turkish ethnic community in Bulgaria creates preconditions for some scientific disputes. Absolutizing the role of one or another of the three components, researchers formulate various hypotheses. Until a few decades ago, the thesis of the purely Anatolian origin of the Turkish ethnic community in Bulgaria dominated. According to its authors, it arose as a result of the migration of certain masses from Anatolia. In doing so, they completely ignore the role of the other two components. The ideologues of the so-called revival process, while completely ignoring the role of colonization and Turkic settlers, substantiated the hypothesis of the purely Bulgarian root of the Turkish population. According to them, this population could not be considered ethnic Turks because its ancestors were not Turks by origin. The presence of a certain percentage of Turks in the composition of this community had not changed the nature of its ethnogenesis. The fact that the Turkish minority in Bulgaria was consolidated as a result of the unification of certain Turkic and local groups with the Ottoman Turks cannot be a serious reason for disputing its special ethnic character and its existence in general. Bulgarian, Russian and many other ethnic groups were formed along this path. To begin with, ethnicity is a complex phenomenon and cannot be reduced to only a biological level, and considered as an extension of blood kinship. According to a number of researchers, ethnicity is more socio-historical than a biological category. While in its emergence, the community of the territory, the landscape, are of decisive importance, subsequently the defining mark becomes the ethnic consciousness. Ethnic self-awareness may in some cases not coincide with historical origins. According to M. Weber, the subjective belief in the common origin, regardless of whether it is real or imaginary, is important. One ethnic group can live in different countries, or several ethnic groups, in one country. Therefore, the Turkish ethnic minority in Bulgaria arose from that community which was consolidated in the Ottoman period. Until the Russo-Turkish War, 1877–1878, it was a constituent part of the Turkish nation, and then began to separate into an independent ethnic minority. For several decades, it has been building and improving its religious and cultural institutions, striving to conquer and expand its religious and ethnic rights. Their scope in different periods largely depends on the character of the established political system, and on the ideological and political concepts of the respective ruling circles.